In the second part of episode 1, we discuss utilizing the anger of the oppressed for liberation, a pursuit that is contextual by nature. We reflect on liberation as a praxis in that it is a constant self-actualization that can only be achieved as a community. Ma'am MJ and Sir Marko say that we, as people, desire order, and order is founded upon values. We emphasize the importance of engaging in conversation, in understanding the consequence of losing engagement, like for the case of cancel culture, and that education must incorporate an understanding of social realities and values which are not universal nor static. And if judgments and systems are proven to be oppressive, then they should be continuously challenged.
So
I
yeah.
think it also has to do with the fact that anger is so attractive. Like it's so easy to be angry. And basically, diba, it's easy to be angry, especially when you're the one that has been hurt. But I do understand it in a way na, of course, if not the oppressed, then who, diba? And if you obligate the oppressor to be fully accountable for humanization. Freire also tells us that they bring with them certain burdens pa rin of their own dominance, na they tend to bring ideologies of their own aligned with their own normalization into the movements of freedom. Therefore, it is yes, our comment section is correct. Still oppressive. And it will just recreate an entire system, and I do understand that. And it's a very rude awakening. Actually, it's a revelation on our part. Because we do find, diba, we do find ourselves angry when things happen. We do find ourselves
And you should.
suffering. Yes,
Yeah, and you
Mhm.
should be angry. Um, I feel na parang being angry has some. I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but I do think that with the discourse online, no, anger has some negative connotation to it in the way that people say, "Wag ka na magalit kung wala ka naman magagawa." Right?
Mhm.
Or wag ka na magsalita kung hindi naman makakatulong, right? And it's anger, and in some way as a professional, probably as a citizen, I understand how anger itself probably isn't helpful. Pag doon ka na nag-stop, pag galit ka, tapos galit ka lang, walang magagawa. Tatama nga yung mga tao, walang magagawa yung galit mo. Right? But if you are angry and if you use that anger to engage, if you use that anger to liberate, diba, according to Freire, um, then that anger is then fruitful. Then that anger will get us somewhere, and not just you as a person and as a citizen, but us as a community. Because remember, all these things, liberation, humanization, dehumanization, they cannot be achieved alone. They have to be
Mhm.
achieved, or they have to be, we have to work together as a community to achieve this.
Mhm.
It cannot be an individual fight.
That's why there's the uh, not exactly privilege, but um, how do I put this? More of having that position for the oppressors to liberate, not exactly just themselves, but everyone. Because like the quote says, uh, necessity is the mother of all inventions. In a similar context, this is what Freire is telling us. Those people who are at a disadvantage are the ones that are likely to question the system. Because when you are
Yeah,
at an
correct,
advantage just from
correct.
cost benefit, yeah, just from a simple cost benefit analysis, it's less likely that you will disengage from the system, let alone
Correct,
question. Yeah.
correct.
So having being at a disadvantage broadens your perspectives on what should not be and what could be if we just change things. Because changing things, of course, would uh, possibly get you at a better position than just staying with the status quo. I guess
Correct.
what we only need to ask here is to what extent are we ready to do that? And to what extent it's right to ask and enable the oppressed to change the system, or at least do efforts that will change the system. Because systems are systems in the first place because they
Mm.
put things in order, and the human beings need order
We
in
like
whatever context,
we love it.
from the most legitimate institutions to the most vile ones. Yeah. Even mafias, although they are doing crime, they still operate to some extent in an organization which necessitates order. So everything requires, as far as humans are concerned, order. And what happens when you challenge the status quo? Um,
Anarchy.
that order becomes at risk as well, and sometimes in a bad way. That's why there's this conflict between oppressed and the oppressors, because a conflict that's not necessarily right versus wrong. The oppressors being wrong and the oppressed being right. In most cases, both parties think that they're right. Because going back to Freire, you have here oppressors not necessarily thinking that they're doing the wrong thing, but thinking they're doing the right thing. They're keeping things orderly, and that becomes problematic, especially when you have angry uh, people who are oppressed who wants to change things. So you have conflict um, following that dynamic. Yeah. Kasi I think this is also signs of the times why people are more inclined towards these ideas. Because if you look at what's in and what's not today, as far as scholars and ideas are concerned, a lot of people are more inclined towards revolutionaries, towards liberating ideas, because uh, you're you not just from the sense of or not just because of their rationalization, but their ideas also sound good to you, uh, so much so that you can identify yourself with them. That's why even in Twitter you will see people like Freire, Eric Fromm, those people that think that values are not necessarily universal. They're not supposed to be static. Even Nietzsche, di ba? These people who are the ones who preach that we should always constantly challenge values.
But I think we
Yes.
should, diba? There it is a continuous um process. We should always challenge values because what may be right in a certain age, in a certain context, might not be for the succeeding age in the succeeding context. I think there's no harm in saying that we were wrong, diba? Parang, or in this particular situation, we were wrong. There was an error of judgment. And that brings me to cancel culture, right? And I
Umph.
think, yeah. And I think that the problem that we're having now as a society is that as we have developed and as these modes of communication have become more customizable, is the word. We are now at liberty individually to customize the information that we receive and that we produce. And so, in effect, if we do not like a particular concept, we would go, okay, you're canceled. I don't like you. But the issue that we're finding out now in this podcast is that systems are internalized and beliefs are internalized. And, we're all human. Ha, char, diba? I mean, being human means making mistakes, and being human means acknowledging mistakes. And then while Freire doesn't particularly put it in that particular context, is because where he's coming from, di ba? They were civil war, tama ba, Marco? Parang there were revolution historical. Marco
There
is the
were
historical
revolutions there.
person, right? He was in a revolution. So, but it doesn't mean that his ideas still don't matter to us. Um, and which brings me back to my point of, if everything is customizable online and if I can cancel someone, then I also risk losing an engagement and a particular learning point, right? And because, I mean, people have ridiculous ideas. People have wrong ideas. I mean, it's ridiculous the things that you read online. But the people who write these things and the people who spew these things are also human. right? And as we mentioned earlier, they might not know that their values are wrong. And if we
Mm.
cancel them and we don't engage and we don't battle oppression in a Freire kind of way, when he says battle oppression, we should recognize its causes, then the conversation stops there. Then it doesn't get solved. Then, we don't engage in a conversation and we run the risk of people not understanding why we're mad in the first place, going back to our conversation of being angry. Diba?
Mm.
You know, um, and I think it's important to engage, but there's a caveat to that. Don't engage with trolls. It's hard. I tried. It doesn't need to make you angry. It doesn't help anyone, right? I think we can still choose when we engage, and if we engage. But I think what I'm saying is that in terms of attitude, and how we engage with people who may have committed an error in judgment or might have said something wrong in response to, for example, gender, maybe the way to do it is, for example, as a woman, diba, who is always oppressed by society, right? Again, in
Basically.
particular context, my oppression is your oppression, right? Because we are from different contexts and we were raised differently. Our capital might be different, like we have different capital. So engaging in a particular conversation might be the way to go. And engaging doesn't really mean talking to that particular person. Engaging means, writing a paper about it, or doing a podcast about it, or writing a tweet, or making a TikTok. I don't know. But I mean, we have our own ways of doing it and we have our own ways of engaging. And going back to Freire, he says, diba, liberation is praxis and it is continuous, right?
Mm.
And it has to be continuous, and it has to be, um, we as citizens, we as human beings have to keep aspiring towards it. It may be
Mm.
lonely. It actually says that it is lonely. And the reason why people don't like doing it is because they risk the they risk alienation, diba, from their society. And interestingly, one of the comments that I read on the academic integrity module, one of the questions that the students posed was that, how can I, as a student, have integrity if my peers, I'm paraphrasing, if my peers are pressuring me to cheat? And my answer is, it's hard. I mean, I'm not perfect. It's not like I haven't cheated, like on a test in my younger years. Diba? When I didn't understand what that could mean for me and my reputation, diba? But again, it's continuous practice. You say to yourself, okay, I did this mistake and I've done this and I've gone through this. And this is where I want to be. And so I make decisions after that continuously go towards the goal of, in this case, in our podcast, humanization. I mean, no one is
Mm.
perfect, diba? But the conversation is there and we can continue in that conversation.
I think MJ actually hit a very important point there when it comes to the context of hearing in regard to humanization. Because when you again review Freire's thoughts, um, he was a fan of existentialism, uh, the idea that any essence uh, is preceded by existence. That what we have here is the world, and in the world, as we live it, we develop values, and these values change over time. So much so that what was right before, in a different context in the world, might not necessarily be correct anymore. For example, the way women were treated in the past might not be correct now. And in that transition and that change of practice, you have a lot of conflict, of course, that comes with people that who were used to that, and people who are uh, don't want to be used to that anymore. And again, it's uh, it's simply human nature that most of us forget when it comes to understanding ourselves. We think that human nature is static, that after the Enlightenment, everything that comes with being human was already solved via rationalization. We are meant to be rational animals, and that's it. When there are some things that change truly when it comes to our historical circumstances. And yeah, in conjunction with what MJ also said about praxis in Freire's thought, in Freire's philosophy, uh, uh, there's the importance of because praxis goes all the way back to Marxist thought or Marxist philosophy that things that are there tell so much about human beings than what human beings thought of themselves. Kumbaga, things that exist tells us more about who we are than what we think we are. To say it in a more simpler context. I think pareho lang yung sinabi ko. Pero I hope I was able to capture the point there. Uh, Ayun. And this is what Fieri is asking us to do when we try to consider his ideas in today's context. To accept that idea that things are not the only one changing, but also are ideas that we thought were universal and never changing. And we have to just accept that if we want things to become better. Uh, which also brings us to what MJ said earlier about exploring causes rather than human beings, because what you have now today are people vilifying other people because they have different values that might be outdated indeed, uh, but also values that they don't want to change yet. So do you have that conflict with person A believing that things should be progressive and person B that thinks that things should still stay as they are? What often happens in that conflict, person A uh, prosecutes person B and person B uh, just feels oppressed. So you have there a very toxic relationship between the two that ends up very destructive in so much that we don't develop any change, but what we have is just static conflict. People not talking to each other anymore and sticking to what they believe. So there's that dialogue because of again things that are there today like cancel culture. You prefer to just cancel the other person to not listen to the other person anymore, assuming that they're a person, not someone hired to just cause trouble. But assuming they are a person, uh, we have developed this habit of just canceling them, trying not to listen to them as much as possible, and sticking to our own lane, which can be really toxic when it comes to changes that we want, that we want to be tangible. Because admit it or not, we need the other person as much as the other person needs us. So there needs to be a dialogue. There needs to be a communication between the two, so much so that we can establish new values, not abandon the other person for our values. Because if you look at that logic, you're just doing what the oppressor did, as what MJ quoted earlier on with Paolo Freire. You have people trying to put the other person down because of ideas. And whenever that happens, when we think that our ideas are far more important than the next person, things really become toxic. So there, just to add more context to what MJ was saying, and even if you review um, that part of history, where you have uh, that that who set up has that oppressor and oppressed. There's always that challenge with either parties not to destroy the other, but rather to change the traditions that the other has imposed. Not in the context of the other, kasi the other is also a technical term. Ayun.
Other being an
uh,
alienated person because they are different
Oo.
from you. Yon.
Mm.
Technical term.
Kasi ganun
Explain
din yung
in
nangyayari.
MJ's words.
Mm.
So basically, throughout this discussion, we've identified the problem as sort of being like the internalization and reproduction of the oppressive system, and not necessarily the existence of the oppressor, um, but rather the system that imposes and allows and enables this behavior to keep going, and very painful stuff. So a majority po kasi of substantial discussions and contemporary movements, I guess, is occurring right now on social media, and in rather minuscule platforms that have been extended far and beyond. I guess it's also important for us to discuss na how language and social media and how these discussions further fuel or let's say even address the issue, because from our experiences of engaging in these kinds of things, um, many of us, we point out like why does it have to happen like this? Why do workers still get paid minimum wage that does not actually satisfy the minimum, diba? And it's hard for people to live in this certain way. And this we bring up issues about gender, we bring up issues about race and existence and womanhood, and as we've defined earlier, being the other. And instead we receive responses that tell us, well, life isn't fair, um, and that in itself should be enough. They say, they tell us that life isn't fair. It just so happens na ganun talaga. And it's hard for us to to accept that because it is an internalization. So if I
Can I
guess
comment
let's
on
put
that
ourselves.
quickly
Yes,
before
ma'am.
you move on to your next point? Kasi parang
Please
I think
do.
that's something that even I am guilty of in saying, look, life isn't fair and it's a given. But Freire tells us that this given shouldn't be the norm, right? I mean,
Exactly, ma'am.
in the let's going back to humanization and dehumanization, do we just accept that people are dehumanized and that's it, right? And going back to previous conversations, even 3 years ago when the drug war was happening, and I think it was on my second year in FEU, and a lot of the students at that time were not concerned at all, zero. And I think some of them are, and I think it's unfair to say that they weren't. But if I were to compare my personal experience with engaging in students nowadays, like this year, last year, versus 3 years ago when I first started, students were like, I have more important things to worry about, and why
Mm.
should I care about people dying when they're not me, right? And I remember my response to that in the classroom, that you should care because it could be you. And the next year, interestingly, one of my students had spoken up when we, talked about the same thing in class. One of my students spoken up and said, actually, ma'am, I would like to share. And I thought he would, because he seemed like the student who didn't care about anything. Like parang wala lang sa kanya yung discussions. But I'm sure hindi. Pero parang that was just me as a teacher. That was my perception. He said, actually, nadampot ako ng police. I shouldn't be laughing when I'm saying this. Pero parang at the time, everyone was like, what? Like, because somebody had said previously na parang, and it was very sensitive because one of their um, classmates' dad was a police officer, and he was very protective of his father, which is, I mean, a given. I mean, but that's a natural response. But what changed the conversation entirely was when the student had said, actually, I was taken to, and yung word niya, dinampot ako. And I'm like, what do you mean, dinampot ka? I mean, nandito ka. So parang, like, can you please explain? And he said, he was, and I was like, what were you wearing? To parang, trying to connect his experience, the thing that was happening previously, which, um, yung mga tambay, quote unquote, right? And he said he was wearing chinelas, shorts, boxer shorts, and asando. And he was inutusan daw siya ng nanay niya bumili ng something at like nighttime. And then police officers approached him and they led him to a precinct. Tapos nung nasa presinto na daw siya, when they were questioning him and stuff, he said na parang nasabi niya, estudyante ako ng FEU. And when he said that, their demeanor automatically changed. Parang apparently the officers were like, okay, estudyante ka pala. So we'll let you go. And I didn't expect that because I thought, I was gonna give up on the conversation because parang it was too sensitive and parang sometimes things like this people aren't ready to hear. But that conversation really struck me as a person, as a teacher, and I think it struck also the classmates because everybody was silent. And suddenly people started telling stories of their own in that same classroom. Like one of their classmates, one of the other students, their batchmate was the one after Kian de los Santos. So right, Kian de los Santos was the first sort of like big name na
Yes.
napatay. There was another student, parang grade 5 din siya, na magaling siya sa math. And the student said, "Ma'am, actually, kabatch ko siya." And I'm like, oh my God, like I wasn't me as a teacher, I wasn't prepared for that conversation. But I mean, that conversation was here, so let's go. And then I asked, like, how did you feel? Like, were you okay? I mean, that must have been very traumatic because it's someone you know, and suddenly they're gone, and then they're gone not because of any sickness or whatever. They're gone because somebody had taken their life, and everybody in that school, she said, mourned the loss. And she said that it was her turning point in terms of looking at things differently. Now, I mean, my question now, not just my students who may be listening or to them, but my question is more philosophical. One is, ihintayin pa ba natin na nandun na tayo sa sitwasyon kung saan tayo yung biktima para magsalita? Diba? And there are a lot of risks. Accompanied by this. And for example, my sister, who at the time was studying in Ateneo, no, her friend pala, this is a funny story. Her friend who was studying in Ateneo at the time, so Ateneo at the time of the drug war, they were rallying and all that, they were rallying in the Katipunan, and they went outside the school, and I think also LaSalle had rallies, and FEU also had their own sort of like mini thing. It wasn't really a rally, it was a sort of like a program, no, because schools were now realizing that students were being targeted for this. And the guy, the friend of my sister, his parents had told his parents had told them not to engage, not to participate in the rally, because at the time there were already police officers ready to arrest outside parang parang Katipunan. So they were there. It was already visible. And the reason why they weren't storming the gates is because of the privilege that these Atenean children had. Right? I mean, if you, let's say, kidnap an Atenean, chances are you wouldn't do it because chances are, even if they aren't rich, parang the name and the privilege surrounding them would be too great, right? So, and if you compare that, for example, to a public school child, that public school child wouldn't have that same privilege, right? And so I think in this conversation, ako na yung tumatalak. Pero parang what I'm just trying to say is that we have to understand that the nuance that comes with speaking up. Because if we understand the difficulty, then we will understand people who don't. And then we as more privileged beings will be, in fact, can, diba, help those who don't and can help them speak up because we're not the ones parang directly affected by this. And backtracking to my kwento, that particular child, his parents had said to him, if you participate, like, we will take you out. And then, funny, kasi they still participated. Tapos, his parents found out because funny, nabalita siya.
Ayun.